Kill the analog feed now, Curtis Bell warned, reaching for the breaker as 6 battered radios lit green across the rescue station. Dan Mercer stood over the last unit, one hand gripping his red-handled screwdriver, while Commander Elena Ward watched 6 signal bars rise on the monitor behind him. Torn red scrap labels lay beside a sealed bag of missing frequency filters. "Don't touch that switch," Dan said quietly. "Someone is still calling." 3 hours earlier, the same 6 radios had arrived at Dan's workbench like bodies no one intended to bury properly. Curtis shoved the dented metal cart across the concrete floor of North Valley Equipment Depot, and the radios struck one another with 6 hollow knocks. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Wind pressed against the garage doors with a low, uneven moan, carrying the smell of rain, machine oil, and hot dust through the gaps. Each radio wore a crooked red label stamped scrap, unsafe. "Truck comes at 6, Curtis said, smoothing the front of his work jacket as several technicians slowed to watch. His voice carried the practiced patience of a man explaining something obvious to someone beneath him. "Pull the batteries, separate the metals, and try not to turn this into another rescue mission." A few men smiled. Dan did not. He looked at the radios, then at Curtis. What failed? Everything that mattered. Curtis tapped the top machine with 2 fingers. "They're dead." Dan's eyes moved to the 6th radio. Black discoloration circled its battery cover, but the stain was too even, too glossy at the edges. Burn damage feathered outward. This looked painted on. Near the loading door, a woman in a weathered rescue jacket paused with a notebook tucked beneath one arm. Dan had seen her arrive to review inventory, but she had offered only her first name, Elena, and had spent more time watching than speaking. Curtis noticed her and softened his tone. "We take safety seriously here. Old equipment creates false confidence." "And working equipment?" Dan asked. Curtis's smile held. "Working equipment doesn't arrive on a scrap cart." Dan pulled the 6th radio toward him. The plastic casing was cold beneath his palm. He removed his red-handled screwdriver from the worn canvas roll beside his toolbox and loosened the battery cover while the security camera above his bench blinked steadily. Curtis stepped closer. "I gave you a disposal order, not permission to diagnose." Dan stopped before lifting the cover. "If it's dead, opening it changes nothing." For 1 second, Curtis's polite expression tightened. Then he stepped back and folded his arms. Inside, the battery contacts were clean. "No melted insulation. No warped plastic." Dan connected a protected bench lead, checked the voltage, then touched his probe to the power rail. Static cracked from the speaker. Everyone near the bench turned. The sound faded, returned, and sharpened into a thin voice buried beneath interference. "Black Ridge, Channel 6, radio check." A green indicator flashed once. Elena's pen stopped above her notebook. Curtis lunged forward and tore the power lead from the bench. The radio went dark. The sudden silence seemed louder than the laughter had been. "Residual recording," Curtis said. "Nothing more." Dan looked at the loose cable in Curtis's hand. "Recordings don't ask for a radio check." Elena took 1 step closer but did not defend him. "Can you reproduce it?" "Not without knowing what was removed." Dan opened the casing fully. Where a frequency filter should have sat, 4 clean solder points surrounded an empty rectangle. The metal was bright, recently disturbed, without dust or heat damage. He removed 3 screws and placed them carefully in a magnetic tray, preserving their position beneath the camera. Curtis glanced toward the office clock. "You've made your point. Strip them and go home to your boy." The mention of Noah landed harder than the insult. Dan had promised to help finish his son's science project before the school trip. Still, rescue equipment did not become harmless merely because someone had signed a label. He reached for the 2nd radio. 1 hour, he said. "Then I'll decide whether these are scrap." "That decision isn't yours. Neither is the signal that came through." Elena's gaze shifted from Dan to Curtis, lingering on the man's clenched hand around the disconnected lead. No one believed Dan yet, but someone had become afraid of a dead machine making noise. Dan opened the next 2 radios. Each contained the same clean rectangular absence. Then he lifted the cover from the fourth and felt the room narrow around him. The identical filter had been removed with the identical star-shaped tool. The fourth radio carried the same star-shaped scar, and by the time Dan opened the sixth, the laughter had drained from the workbench. Curtis Bell stood beneath the fluorescent lights with the disconnected power lead still wrapped around his fist, while Elena Ward watched 6 identical sets of tool marks catch the white glare. Close them. I need to document the condition. That wasn't a request. The ventilation fans hummed above them, pushing the smell of warm dust and solder across the concrete floor. Dan's hands remained steady as he photographed each screw beside its matching serial number. Then Curtis reached past him and turned the security camera away from the bench. Privacy issue, Curtis said, giving Elena a courteous smile. We don't record visitors without written notice. Elena glanced toward the camera's new angle. It now showed the loading door, the ceiling pipes, and almost none of the radios. She wrote something in her notebook but said nothing. Curtis placed both palms on the workbench and lowered his voice. Dan, you have a son waiting at home. You have a reliable job with benefits. Don't turn 6 condemned radios into a problem bigger than you can afford. The words sounded like concern. The message beneath them did not. Dan looked down at the red scrap labels. One corner of the label on the 6th unit had begun to peel, revealing the faded words Rescue Reserve beneath it. He pressed the label back without removing it. I'm not trying to make it bigger, he said. I'm trying not to make it disappear. Curtis exhaled through his nose. Go home. Dan closed each casing without replacing the screws, sealed them in numbered envelopes, and placed the envelopes beneath the radios where the camera could no longer see. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. Before leaving, he covered the machines with a clean anti-static cloth so no dust would settle into the exposed housings. Elena watched that small gesture longer than she watched his face. By 8 the next morning, North Valley Equipment Depot no longer felt like a repair shop. Folding chairs had been arranged between the tool benches. A projection screen stood in front of the parts cages. Someone had brewed expensive coffee that smelled darker and smoother than the burnt pot the technicians usually shared. Victor Hale moved through the room shaking hands, remembering names and asking after families. His charcoal suit was modest enough to look practical, but the polished shoes beneath it had never crossed an oil-stained floor before. Modernization isn't about contracts, Victor told the room. It's about making sure every rescuer comes home. Behind him, a slide showed a clean digital command center glowing blue beneath the words Emergency Communications Modernization Program. The 6 old radios sat uncovered on a side table, their red labels facing the audience like warning signs. Dan stood near the back in his faded blue-gray work shirt, sleeves rolled to his forearms. Curtis had removed the chair beside him before the meeting began, explaining that seating was reserved for department representatives. We respect craftsmanship, Victor continued, but there comes a point when attachment to old equipment becomes unsafe. Several heads turned toward Dan. A younger technician whispered that Dan had spent half the night trying to resurrect scrap. Another replied that men with toolboxes always thought they knew more than engineers with licenses. Dan heard them. He kept his eyes on the radios. Victor invited questions. Dan raised one hand. Curtis stepped between him and the aisle. Technical concerns should go through your supervisor. I found matching tool marks on all 6 units. Submit a maintenance note. The camera was turned away before I could finish documenting them. Curtis smiled for the room. The camera was adjusted to protect a visitor's privacy. Elena sat in the front row with her notebook closed on her knee. She did not defend Dan. Her gaze moved once toward the camera above his bench, still aimed at the loading door. Victor approached Dan with a sympathetic expression. Mr. Mercer, I understand you care about the work. I care about why 6 machines failed the same way. And that is admirable. But good intentions are not a safety standard. The room settled into a soft, approving silence. Victor placed a hand near Dan's shoulder without quite touching him, the gesture of a man offering dignity while taking away authority. These units were inspected by certified specialists. The The documentation is complete. Continuing to interfere could expose this depot to liability. Dan looked at the thick contract on the presentation table. Its cover was crisp and white. Beside it lay photocopies of the disposal reports, each marked approved. "May I see the originals?" Elena asked. Victor turned toward her, his smile unchanged. "Of course. Commander's office receives every required document. These are copies. The originals are in off-site records storage. Standard retention policy." Elena opened her notebook again. Curtis moved quickly to the radios and tapped one casing. "There's nothing mysterious here. Those frequency filters were already ruined before the units arrived." Dan's eyes lifted. He had not said the missing parts were frequency filters. Not to Curtis. Not to Victor. Not to anyone in that room. Elena's pen stopped. Victor's expression remained pleasant, but his attention shifted toward Curtis for half a second. Dan crossed to the side table, careful not to touch the machines. He arranged the 6 loose screws on a magnetic tray, turning each until the matching star-shaped scratches faced upward. "Same tool," he said. Victor looked at them briefly. "Or the same repair shop." "There's no repair entry." "Then perhaps the records are incomplete." A minute ago, they were complete. The fluorescent lights buzzed over the silence that followed. Victor straightened the cuff of his shirt. "Mr. Mercer, I'm going to recommend that you be removed from this review. You are too personally invested to remain objective." Curtis handed Dan a written notice assigning him responsibility for improper access to condemned equipment. The form already carried yesterday's date, though it had not existed when Dan left the building. Dan read it once, folded it neatly, and slipped it into his shirt pocket. "I'll sign after I receive a copy." Curtis's jaw tightened. "This isn't a negotiation." "No," Dan said quietly. "It's a record." Elena looked from the notice to the disposal reports. Dan followed her gaze and noticed a pale code printed at the bottom of each photocopied page. He had seen that template before when the depot updated its software in May. Yet every report claimed the radios had failed inspection 3 weeks earlier, in April. Dan touched the edge of the nearest copy without lifting it. If that form had not existed on the date beside the signature, who had rewritten the history of 6 working radios? And why had Curtis known exactly what was missing inside them? Dan kept his finger beside the pale form code until the conference room emptied around him. The disposal reports claimed the 6 radios had failed in April, but the template printed beneath the signatures had not been installed at North Valley Equipment Depot until May. Curtis gathered the copies too quickly, squared their edges against the table, and slid them beneath Victor Hale's contract. "You're done for the day. I need a copy of the notice. Payroll will send it." 3 sentences, all polite, all final. The projector fan wound down with a tired whir, leaving only the fluorescent buzz and the bitter smell of coffee cooling in paper cups. Dan watched Curtis carry the documents into the glass office and lock the door. He could have argued. Instead, he crossed to the side table and covered the 6 radios again, making sure the anti-static cloth did not catch on the exposed screws. The gesture earned a faint laugh from one of the younger technicians. "Tucking them in?" Dan folded the loose corner beneath the first unit. "Keeping dust out. They're scrap. Dust doesn't know that." The technician shook his head and walked away. Near the loading door, Elena closed her notebook. She had heard the exchange, but her expression offered neither approval nor sympathy. "You noticed the form code," she said. "I noticed it was wrong. That doesn't prove sabotage." "No," Dan looked through the glass wall toward Curtis's office. "It proves the paper came later than the story." Elena studied him for another second, then asked Ruth Alvarez for access to the maintenance archive. Ruth's mouth tightened. "I can pull records after inventory closes." "How long?" "Tomorrow morning. By then the truck may be here." Ruth glanced at the covered radios. "Not if I don't sign the release." It was the first kindness anyone had offered Dan all day, and she disguised it as procedure. He nodded once, protecting her from the need to explain. At 5:43, his phone vibrated inside his shirt pocket. Noah's name glowed across the cracked screen. Dan stepped into the narrow corridor beside the parts cage, where the smell of cardboard and machine grease softened the sharpness of the shop. "Hey, buddy, are you coming home soon?" Noah asked. His voice was trying hard not to sound disappointed. "I'm supposed to bring the signal light model tomorrow. The left bulb still flickers." Dan closed his eyes for half a breath. On the wall beside him, an employee notice warned that unauthorized overtime could result in disciplinary action. Beneath it sat an envelope from his landlord, folded twice where Dan had opened it during lunch. "I remember," he said. "I may need one more hour. It's okay." A pause. "Did you eat?" Dan looked at the vending machine dinner he had not bought because the rent envelope was still in his pocket. "Not yet. You always tell me circuits work better when they're not running empty." Despite himself, Dan smiled. "That sounds like something a very annoying 11-year-old would say. A very smart one." "That too." Noah's breathing softened. "Mom's radio still broken?" The question moved quietly through him. Leah's old kitchen radio had sat on the top shelf at home for 3 years, its wooden casing worn smooth near the volume dial. A short recording remained inside it, Leah humming while Noah, much younger, laughed at something beyond the microphone. Dan had found the correct replacement filter 6 months ago but had never installed it. Repairing the radio meant hearing her again. It also meant risking the recording if his hands slipped. "Still waiting," he said. "Maybe this weekend." "Okay. Don't forget the red wire goes on the left side of my model." "I won't." When the call ended, Dan remained in the corridor until the screen went dark. Then he returned to his bench, opened the dented tin he kept beneath his toolbox, and lifted out the filter wrapped in wax paper. It was the part he had saved for Leah's radio. It was also close enough to the missing rescue filters to create a temporary diagnostic bridge. Ruth saw it in his palm. "That yours?" "Yes. The depot won't reimburse you." "I'm not asking it to. You could lose your job for touching those units after the notice." Dan looked at the red label showing beneath the cloth. Rescue Reserve remained faintly visible where one corner had peeled away. "Then I won't alter the evidence." He connected the filter with removable test leads instead of solder, photographed every contact point, and wrote the part number in the repair log. Beside it, he added one sentence in block letters: "Personal component used for diagnostic purpose only. No permanent modification performed." Elena had returned from the archive empty-handed. She stopped several feet from the bench. "That component isn't one of the originals." "No." "Then any successful result could be challenged." "Yes." "And you're writing that down?" Dan capped the pen. "A test that hides its limits isn't a test." Elena's eyes moved from the log to the small filter resting between the leads. "Why use your own part?" Dan adjusted the lamp so its heat would not fall directly on the board. "Because if one of these can still call out, someone may need to hear it before the paperwork catches up." He switched on the isolated power supply. The radio gave a low hiss, then a clean carrier tone. Dan immediately shut it down. He did not celebrate. He simply wrote the voltage, duration, and result into the log, then removed his component and returned it to the wax paper. Across the shop, Curtis stood inside the glass office with his back partly turned. His phone glowed in his hand. He typed quickly, unaware that the dark window reflected the screen toward the work floor. He opened them. "Move the bag before Ward. Checks inventory." Elena saw only the final words before Curtis stepped away. "The bag." She looked toward Ruth. Ruth had already pulled up the electronic inventory panel. Her fingers stopped above the keyboard. "That's strange," she said. "What?" Elena asked. Ruth stared at the line for storage locker 14, where her access authorization should have appeared. "Someone changed the code last night." Dan folded the wax paper around Leah's filter and placed it back in the tin. The small act he had made to help a machine speak had done something more important. It had frightened the people who needed 6 radios to remain silent. By morning, Dan's honesty had become the strongest argument against him. Curtis placed the diagnostic log on the conference table as though it were a confession, pointing to the line where Dan had recorded using his own frequency filter. "Unauthorized component. Temporary test lead." Still unauthorized. Rain ticked against the high windows of North Valley Equipment Depot, and the fluorescent lights threw a pale reflection across the laminated page. Elena Ward stood at the far end of the table, one hand resting beside her closed notebook, while Victor Hale read the entry with the patient disappointment of a man examining someone else's poor judgment. "Mr. Mercer," Victor said, "you understand why this compromises the integrity of the equipment." Dan looked at the log, then at the 6 radios waiting beneath the anti-static cloth. "It compromises the test as legal proof." "Exactly. It doesn't change what the radio did." Victor folded the page carefully. "That distinction may feel important to you. It is less comforting to the people responsible for public safety." Curtis nodded as if the matter had been settled with compassion rather than control. He told Ruth Alvarez that Locker 14 would remain sealed until corporate inventory staff arrived. Ruth's fingers tightened around the ring of keys at her waist, but she did not challenge him. Dan could see the pressure behind her silence. One objection from a technician could be called insubordination. One objection from a warehouse supervisor close to retirement could become a reason to replace her. "The service records," Elena said. Curtis turned toward her. "We've already provided them. You provided photocopies. The originals are archived. Then pull the digital history." Victor's smile remained smooth. "Commander Ward, we are happy to cooperate, but opening restricted inventory and questioning certified inspections based on one employee's improvised test could create unnecessary confusion during a weather event." Outside, wind pushed rainwater beneath the loading door in a thin silver line. Somewhere beyond the walls, a truck reversed with 3 slow warning beeps. Elena looked at Dan, not warmly, not cruelly, but as someone measuring how much risk his judgment might carry. "Did you know the component belonged to the wrong serial group?" "Yes." "Did you know a successful transmission could not prove the original filter was deliberately removed?" "Yes." "Then why proceed?" Dan placed his red-handled screwdriver on the table, parallel to the edge. "To find out whether we were looking at 6 dead radios or 6 radios missing the same part." Elena's gaze dropped to the screwdriver, then to the identical star-shaped marks visible in Dan's photographs. She still had no reason to accept his conclusion, but she had begun to separate what he knew from what he merely suspected. Ruth returned with a gray archival binder and set it down between them. The metal rings clicked open. The pages smelled faintly of toner and damp cardboard. "These are the service logs exported before the last software migration," she said. Curtis's expression changed only at the corners of his mouth. "Those files are outdated." "They're dated," Ruth replied. "That's not the same thing." Elena turned to the 6 entries. Every radio had failed a load test on April 18th. Every report recommended immediate removal from emergency service. Every conclusion carried the same technician's electronic signature from Hale Emergency Systems. On the surface, the records were clean enough to end the discussion. Dan read them without touching the pages. He followed the margins, revision numbers, footer codes, and alignment of the printed fields. Then he asked one quiet question. "When did North Valley install version 7 of the maintenance system?" Ruth looked toward the old desktop terminal. "First week of May." Dan pointed to the footer beneath the April date. The code ended in V7. A small detail, pale enough to disappear under ordinary light. Elena moved the binder closer to the window. Gray morning light crossed the page, revealing the footer and the faint impressions of old staple holes beneath the upper corner. "The report is dated April 18th, she said. "But this format did not exist until May." Victor leaned forward, his voice calm. "A report can be reprinted after a software update. With a new template," Curtis added. "That happens all the time." Dan studied the page. "A reprint keeps the original data." "Correct," Victor said. "Then why does the conclusion page have different staple holes from the test pages?" Silence settled briefly over the table. The first 3 sheets had 2 narrow punctures near the corner. The conclusion page carried 4, offset by less than half an inch. It had been removed and attached again. Victor did not flinch. "Administrative correction." What was corrected? Elena asked. Possibly a clerical error. Which error? Victor looked toward Curtis. Curtis picked up the binder, too quickly, and turned the conclusion page back over. We can request the archive notes. There's no reason to treat a restapled document as fraud. His explanation was plausible. Offices replaced damaged pages. Digital systems updated old records. Paper moved through too many hands to make every irregularity sinister. Elena did not accuse him. Instead, she asked Ruth to retrieve the physical inspection cards stored inside each radio. Dan removed the battery cover from the 6th unit under the camera's restored angle. Deep inside the compartment, beneath a strip of aging foam, sat a narrow maintenance tag yellowed at the edges. Elena took it with gloved fingers. The tag carried the Black Ridge aviation code, a load test date 92 days before the reported failure, and Elena's own signature. Beneath it was the unit designation of a rescue helicopter once flown by her husband. For the first time, the authority in her posture gave way to something quieter. Her thumb hovered above the faded number but did not touch it. Dan saw grief move through her face and disappear behind discipline. This proves it was working 3 months earlier, she said. It does not prove what happened afterward.
No, Dan answered.
But it gives us something to compare. Victor lowered his voice. Commander, old equipment can degrade quickly, especially after March. Elena looked up. This test was performed in April. Victor paused. Rain struck the window harder, scattering the reflection of his face across the glass. Then I remembered the quarter incorrectly. It was a small mistake, reasonable enough to survive alone. But Elena no longer looked at the records as a complete story. She ordered Black Ridge to retrieve the original audio from the April load test, along with the equipment transfer log. Victor objected that the request would take time. Elena replied that time was exactly what someone had used to rewrite the paper. 20 minutes later, a compressed audio file arrived. Ruth played it through the conference speaker. Static filled the room, followed by a technician reading serial numbers as each radio completed transmission and battery load checks. One by one, all 6 units were marked operational. Then, beneath the rustle of paper and the hum of a helicopter bay, another voice entered the recording, clear, familiar, and impossible to dismiss. Curtis Bell said, "All 6 passed. Put them back in reserve." The recording ended with Curtis Bell's voice still hanging in the conference room. All 6 passed. Put them back in reserve. No one moved. The air conditioner clicked on above the ceiling tiles, suddenly loud enough to hear, and Victor Hale lowered one hand from the binder as though the paper had become hot. Curtis stared at the speaker. That was months ago. 92 days before the failure report, Elena said. Equipment can deteriorate. All 6 at once? Dan asked. Curtis turned toward him. You are not qualified to interpret fleet reliability. Dan did not answer the insult. He replayed the final 12 seconds, listening past the words to the faint carrier tone beneath them. It was clean, stable, and evenly modulated, the sound of 6 radios operating within specification. He stopped the file before Curtis's voice returned. The recording proves they worked in April, Dan said. It does not prove who removed the filters. Victor's shoulders eased slightly. Dan had just stated the limit of his own evidence instead of using the room's silence to accuse anyone.
Elena noticed.
What would prove your diagnosis? She asked. A controlled test. Curtis gave a short laugh. With another part from his personal toolbox? No, Dan said. With a documented equivalent, isolated power, and an independent signal from Black Ridge. Victor glanced at the windows, where rain slid down the glass in wavering lines. Commander Ward, we are drifting into theater. One restored unit would not validate 5 others, and it certainly would not establish misconduct. Then it should be harmless to test one, Elena replied. The room slowed around that sentence. Ruth stopped, turning the key ring at her waist. A technician near the door let his chair settle without dragging it farther across the floor. Victor smiled, but the expression no longer reached his eyes. Of course, under procedure, Within 40 minutes, Dan's workbench had been cleared and photographed. Ruth laid a clean anti-static mat across the steel surface. Elena placed a camera where it could see the radio, Dan's hands, the test equipment, and the sealed component bag supplied by Black Ridge. A rescue communications specialist named Marcus Reed joined by secure video from the station, his face appearing on a monitor beside the oscilloscope. No permanent modification, Elena said. No substitution beyond the documented equivalent. Stop the moment the unit transmits.
Understood, Dan answered.
Curtis stood behind the yellow floor line with Victor. He had recovered his professional tone and now spoke quietly to anyone who would listen about liability, calibration history, and the danger of drawing conclusions from improvised repairs. Dan ignored him. He checked the isolation transformer, verified the meter against a known reference, and read the replacement filter number aloud for the recording. His movements were ordinary, practiced, almost gentle. No flourish, no speech. He cleaned 4 solder pads with a narrow swab, attached temporary leads, and watched the oscilloscope. The first waveform appeared weak and uneven, breaking into jagged peaks before collapsing. A whisper moved through the observers. Curtis folded his arms. There it is. Not yet, Dan said. He adjusted the tuning coil less than a quarter turn. The signal returned, still distorted. He listened to the speaker hiss, then moved the control back by a fraction. The fluorescent lights reflected in the glass face of the oscilloscope. Rain tapped the loading door. Dan's left hand rested flat on the bench so the right would remain steady. Black Ridge, this is North Valley Test Unit 6, Marcus said through the remote link. Transmit when ready. Dan turned the frequency control 3 small clicks. The broken waveform drew itself into a clean, repeating pattern. A green light came on above the radio speaker. North Valley Test Unit 6, Dan said. Radio check. Static answered first. Then Marcus's voice crossed more than 10 miles of storm-darkened terrain with startling clarity. Loud and clear. The chair nearest the wall stopped creaking. Ruth's keys went still. Even the ventilation fan seemed to recede behind the steady carrier tone. Dan watched the meter for 3 seconds, then shut the radio down. Why did you stop? One technician asked. The test objective was transmission, Dan said. Running it longer proves nothing we haven't documented and adds heat to evidence we don't own. Elena placed her palm over the service binder and looked toward Marcus on the screen. Confirm signal strength, time, and frequency. Marcus read the numbers. They matched the original April specifications within tolerance. Elena ordered 3 copies of the recording saved under separate access controls. Then she slid the radio into a clear evidence sleeve and sealed it herself. Victor stepped closer, his voice measured. One functioning unit proves only that Mr. Mercer can rebuild old equipment under favorable conditions. Dan looked at the sealed radio. I didn't rebuild it. You installed a replacement part. I restored the part that was missing. The power section, transmitter, receiver, and board were already working. Victor's jaw tightened for only an instant. Intent remains unproven. I said that before the test. The restraint took away the argument Victor had prepared. Dan was not claiming victory. He was refusing to lie in either direction. Elena turned to the component documentation. Where did the original filter go? That is an inventory question, Victor said. Then we will ask inventory. Ruth brought over the procurement terminal and entered the missing filter's serial family. The old monitor flickered, filling the air with a faint electrical hum. One invoice appeared from Hale Emergency Systems. The line item described a new frequency filter installed at Cedar Pass Rescue Annex 6 weeks earlier. Could be the same model, Curtis said. Ruth enlarged the entry. The full serial number matched the filter listed in Radio 6 manufacturing record. Elena's hand came down slowly on the table. The same serial cannot be inside this radio and installed at Cedar Pass. The filter is not inside this radio, Victor replied. Then it should be at Cedar Pass, Dan said. Ruth searched the receiving records. Cedar Pass had signed for a sealed maintenance kit, but its service report listed a different technician and no radio serial. The invoice had been paid. The part had never been scanned out of North Valley inventory. Curtis stepped forward. This is exactly why internal discrepancies should be handled privately. People can misunderstand unfinished records. Then let's finish them, Elena said. She ordered the invoice, test recording, service log, and radio sealed under one case number. She also instructed Ruth not to erase, move, or overwrite any warehouse footage. Victor's expression remained calm, but a pulse moved once beneath his temple. Commander, escalating an accounting error during an active weather alert may damage public confidence. Elena looked at the green indicator now dark behind the evidence plastic. Public confidence is not protected by hiding the condition of emergency equipment. Dan saw Ruth scanning the invoice. Again, her brow tightened. There's another payment, she said. Same serial? Elena asked. Ruth turned the monitor toward them. The identical filter number had been billed a second time, this time to Pine County Search and Rescue, 3 days after the Cedar Pass invoice. 2 stations had paid for one component that had never left North Valley. Victor stopped speaking. Dan looked beyond the monitor toward Locker 14, its electronic keypad glowing red beneath the warehouse lights. One working radio had proved he was not imagining the sabotage. One duplicated serial suggested the missing parts were not merely hidden. They had been sold more than once, and someone with access to the entire rescue network was making money every time a working machine was declared dead. The duplicated serial number stayed on the monitor after everyone else stopped speaking. One frequency filter had been billed to Cedar Pass Rescue Annex, then billed again to Pine County Search and Rescue, yet the inventory system showed it had never left North Valley Equipment Depot. Ruth Alvarez printed both invoices. The machine drew the pages out with a dry mechanical rasp, then fell silent. Accounting error, Victor Hale said. 2 paid invoices. A clerical duplication. For a part that disappeared from a working radio? Victor turned toward Elena Ward instead of Dan. Commander, this should be reviewed privately by procurement professionals. Public speculation could damage every agency named in those records. The word commander changed the room. Several technicians looked at Elena more carefully, recognizing that the woman in the weathered rescue jacket was not an inventory clerk after all. She did not explain her rank or use it for effect. She simply placed her identification beside the sealed radio and told Ruth to begin a controlled access record for Locker 14. Curtis Bell stepped forward. That locker contains contractor property. Then the inventory sheet will confirm it, Elena said. The code was changed without Ruth's authorization. Cybersecurity rotation. At 2:13 in the morning, Curtis's eyes shifted toward the warehouse cameras. Only for a moment, Dan saw it, and so did Elena. The rain had darkened the high windows, turning the glass walls of the office into mirrors. Victor's reflection stood behind Dan's shoulder, calm and straight-backed, while Curtis's hand moved toward the phone clipped to his belt. Elena asked him to place it on the table. He hesitated before obeying. Ruth retrieved the mechanical override key from a locked cabinet. She signed it out, handed it to Elena, then placed a strip of evidence tape over the electronic keypad, so no one could enter a new code without breaking the seal. Dan remained behind the yellow floor line. You diagnosed the missing components, Elena said. You should observe. I should not open the locker. Why? Curtis asked. Afraid we'll find your fingerprints? Dan looked at him without anger. Because if my hands touch what is inside, you'll spend the next month talking about my hands instead of what was hidden. That answer quieted even the technicians who still doubted him. Elena assigned Ruth and a county security officer to open the locker while the overhead camera recorded continuously. Victor objected that outside counsel should be present. Elena agreed to notify counsel but refused to delay because storm warnings had shifted from yellow to orange, and emergency inventory could not remain inaccessible during an active alert. The mechanical key turned with a hard metallic click. Cold air escaped when the locker door opened, carrying the smell of cardboard, dust, and anti-static plastic. At first, the contents looked ordinary. Sealed cable kits, replacement microphone clips, battery cradles, shipping labels. Then Ruth moved a carton aside. Behind it sat a silver anti-static bag marked Field Returns. The seal had never been logged. Inside were 6 frequency filters, each wrapped separately and marked with a handwritten serial number. The numbers matched the manufacturing records of the 6 radios on Dan's bench. No one spoke. The bag lay on the evidence mat beneath the white inspection light, small enough to hold in one hand and heavy enough to change the meaning of every document in the room. Beside it was a star-shaped driver bit. Its edges carried the same uneven, where visible in Dan's photographs of the radio screws. Ruth's face lost color. These were never entered as returns. The security officer photographed each item before moving it. Under the bag sat the original scrap forms. They were incomplete, serial numbers filled in, failure descriptions left blank, approval lines unsigned. The photocopies Victor had presented carried completed conclusions and electronic signatures. Dan leaned toward the inspection light without crossing the floor line. One serial on the bag ended in a 7 that had been overwritten as a 1. The shape of the correction matched the altered digit on one of the scrap forms. "Photograph that before the bag moves," Dan said. Curtis gave a strained laugh. "Handwriting analysis now?"
No.
"Preservation. You are enjoying this." Dan's gaze stayed on the evidence. No one should enjoy finding out rescue equipment was made useless. Victor removed a folded handkerchief and pressed it once against his upper lip. The movement was small, almost elegant, but it was the first sign that his control required effort. "These could be recovered parts awaiting disposal," he said. "Then why were they invoiced as newly installed at 2 different stations?" Elena asked. "Inventory reconciliation may explain that. Then we will reconcile it." Ruth opened the access log. Curtis's badge had entered the warehouse at 2:13 a.m. on the night before the radios were marked unsafe. There was no maintenance order, no emergency call-out, and no supervisor note. His badge exited 21 minutes later. The camera archive showed a gap from 2:15 to 2:32. "System fault," Curtis said. "The storm last month caused intermittent losses." "The weather was clear that night," Ruth replied. "Camera faults do not wait for weather," Victor said. "Nor do they prove misconduct." He was right about that. A missing video was suspicious, not conclusive. Dan did not pretend otherwise. "Was the entire recording system down?" he asked. Ruth checked the archive. "Only image storage from warehouse camera 3. "What about safety audio?" The depot maintained a low-quality audio channel for alarm verification, separate from the video system. Ruth found the file. Its timestamp continued through all 17 missing minutes. Elena ordered copies made before playback. The speaker hissed with the hollow acoustics of an empty warehouse. A locker door opened. Plastic crinkled. Curtis's voice asked whether all 6 units needed to be processed. Then Victor answered, quieter but unmistakable. "The batch has to be dead before the budget review." Curtis asked what to write in the failure field. Cartwheel squeaked. The recording ended beneath the sound of the loading door closing. The room remained still after the speaker stopped. Rainwater traced slow lines down the glass. The printer's green status light blinked. Waiting for another command no one gave. Elena looked at Victor. What did dead mean? He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was controlled. Removed from active inventory. It is standard shorthand. Before testing? The decision may have been based on age, support limitations, or planned modernization. Then why remove the filters? "I cannot speak to what Mr. Bell may have done." Curtis turned toward him so sharply his badge struck the zipper of his jacket. Victor had not confessed. He had begun separating himself. Curtis saw it. Dan did too. Elena asked the county legal office to place an emergency hold on the modernization contract. The attorney on speakerphone listened to the recording, reviewed the invoices, and answered carefully. The phrase about the batch being dead lacked enough context to prove sabotage by itself. The invoices suggested fraud but required verification from the receiving stations. The locker evidence was serious, yet the county still needed to establish operational harm. Victor seized on the hesitation. Exactly. There is no evidence these obsolete analog units were necessary to current rescue operations. His phone remained on the table, but a new email appeared on the conference monitor from Hale Emergency Systems. The subject line read Legacy Equipment Risk Assessment. The message stated that analog radios no longer served an essential safety function and should be retired without delay. Dan looked at the attachment list beneath it. One file was the emergency communications contract Victor had placed beside the radios. "Open Appendix C," he said. Elena did. The language was plain. Hale Emergency Systems certified that analog radio capacity would remain a mandatory backup whenever digital repeaters, fiber links, or regional power failed. The company had not merely known the old system mattered. It had been paid to preserve it. Outside, the warning lights over the loading bay changed from orange to red. A weather alert rolled across the monitor. Severe storm escalation, northern repeater instability, emergency staffing requested. Elena closed the contract and looked from the 6 recovered filters to the 6 radios under seal. "This is no longer an inventory dispute." Victor asked to continue the conversation in her office, away from the technicians. Elena shook her head. "The people who were told these machines were unsafe will hear the evidence used to decide whether they are safe." Dan could have asked for Curtis's suspension. He could have demanded an apology or told every worker in the room that he had been right. Instead, he asked for independent oversight, continuous video, and permission to test all 6 radios before the storm reached Black Ridge. Elena approved the request. Victor's mask remained in place, but he looked toward the public work floor where the 6 machines would have to be tested under witnesses. The truth had become too large for a locked office, too documented for a private correction, and too dangerous to postpone. By sunset, the same table where Dan had been dismissed as a man too attached to scrap would become the place where an entire rescue system was forced to answer for what it had silenced. By sunset, the workbench at North Valley Equipment Depot no longer belonged to Dan Mercer. It had become an evidence table beneath 3 cameras, 2 white inspection lamps, and the eyes of every technician who had watched 6 radios arrive there as scrap. Rain hammered the metal roof. Red stormlight pulsed above the loading doors, staining the concrete floor in slow flashes. Dan stood at the end of the bench in his faded blue-gray work shirt, sleeves rolled neatly above his wrists. He looked tired, not triumphant. Across from him, Victor Hale arrived with a county attorney and a black document case. Curtis Bell followed several steps behind, pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Ruth Alvarez stood beside locker 14 with her keys removed from her belt and sealed inside an evidence envelope. Elena Ward entered last. She set her rescue identification on the table, turned it so the room could read Commander, Black Ridge Search and Rescue, and said, "This inspection is now part of an active emergency readiness review." The room changed around the title. Chairs stopped shifting. The technicians who had mistaken Elena for a field clerk straightened without being asked. She did not look at Dan. She looked at the 6 radios. "We will proceed in order," she said. "No acquiesctions. No interruptions. Every claim will be answered by a record, a test, or a witness." Victor nodded with practiced respect. "That is all my company has requested." On the table, the first piece of evidence was the promise everyone remembered. 6 battered radios, 6 red scrap, unsafe labels, 6 empty spaces where frequency filters should have been. The second was the silver anti-static bag recovered from locker 14, now sealed beneath county tape. Inside it were the 6 missing filters and the worn star-shaped driver bit. The third was a row of paper records arranged beneath clear covers. The April load test recording, the service log printed on a form that did not exist until May, the duplicated invoices, the 2:13 a.m. access entry, and a transcript from the 17 minutes of audio left behind when the warehouse camera lost its picture. Elena allowed the evidence to remain visible before anyone explained it. That silence carried more weight than a speech. Victor opened his document case. "Before this becomes a public misunderstanding," he said, "the county should remember that maintenance systems are imperfect. Forms are reprinted. Serial numbers are entered incorrectly. Parts are recovered for evaluation. None of that proves a coordinated act." He gestured toward Dan without hostility. Mr. Mercer used a personal component after being instructed not to interfere. His concern may have been sincere, but sincerity does not preserve evidentiary integrity. A murmur moved through the back row. The argument sounded reasonable because part of it was true. Dan had used his own filter. He had touched the radios before they were sealed. Victor continued carefully. One employee made an unauthorized diagnosis. Another employee may have failed to document recovered components. Those are personnel matters, not proof that Hale Emergency Systems endangered anyone. Curtis looked at him. The distance Victor placed between them was quiet but unmistakable. Elena turned to Dan. Did you use a personal filter? Yes. Was it an original component from any of these radios? No. Could your temporary test establish who removed the originals? No, the county attorney wrote something down. Victor's shoulders loosened. For a moment, it appeared the entire case might contract into a disciplinary dispute and an inventory error. Dan did not rush to rescue himself. He placed both hands at his sides and looked at Elena. The temporary filter proved one thing, he said. The radio had not failed in the way the report claimed. And the rest? Elena asked. That requires the original parts and an independent test. Elena gave a small nod toward the doorway. Marcus Reed entered wearing a Black Ridge Communications jacket, carrying a calibrated equipment case sealed with a county tag. He was the specialist who had monitored the first test remotely. This time he would work in full view of the room. I have no employment relationship with Mr. Mercer or Hale Emergency Systems, Marcus said. I will inspect each unit for natural failure, prior repair, deliberate component removal, and operational capacity after documented restoration. Victor's attorney objected to the phrase deliberate removal. Marcus corrected himself without irritation. I will determine whether the physical evidence is consistent with accidental loss, normal failure, or tool-based removal. One by one, the radios were opened beneath the cameras. Marcus examined the power sections first.
No vern traces. No melti din selaschen.
No failed regulators. He studied the black discoloration around Radio 6 and wiped a corner with a solvent swab. The stain came away on the cloth. Surface-applied material, he said. Not thermal damage. Someone in the back whispered. They painted it. Marcus did not confirm the accusation. He moved to the solder pads. Under magnification, each board showed the same clean heat pattern, the same tool pressure, and the same narrow scrape where a filter housing had been lifted. Dan said nothing. He watched the monitor as enlarged images appeared beside the service reports claiming 6 unrelated internal failures. The lies did not collapse dramatically. They simply became harder to stand beside. Marcus compared the star-shaped driver bit from Locker 14 to the marks on the screws. Consistent wear pattern, he said. Not unique enough to identify a person, but consistent with the same tool or an identically worn tool used on all 6 units. Victor recovered quickly, which still supports unauthorized action by Mr. Bell, not corporate direction. Curtis's breath caught. Victor, do not speculate, the attorney warned. Elena raised one hand. We will return to responsibility after operational testing. The 6 original filters were photographed, serials read aloud, and installed under continuous video. Dan was asked to assist only with tuning because Marcus had already documented that the boards required model-specific analog calibration. Victor objected. You are allowing the subject of the review to influence the result. Marcus answered before Dan could. Mr. Mercer identified the correct adjustment sequence in the first controlled test. I am monitoring every movement. Dan stepped to the bench. The air smelled of flux, wet wool, and ozone from the storm outside. He adjusted the first radio until its waveform stabilized, then moved away so Marcus could verify the result independently. Green light, clean carrier. Radio 2 followed, then 3, then 4. No applause came. The room grew quieter with each successful signal. When the 5th radio transmitted, Victor leaned toward Elena. Even if every unit functions in a laboratory setting, Obsolete analog equipment cannot be trusted during an actual regional failure. Elena looked at him. That is why we are testing load. 6 channels will not hold if the northern repeaters collapse. Marcus's hand stopped above the 6th radio. Ruth looked up from the evidence log. Dan turned slowly from the tuning coil. The 6-channel configuration had been written only in Elena's sealed test order. The northern repeaters had not been mentioned in the room. How did you know the load plan? Elena asked. Victor did not blink. It is the obvious configuration. And the northern repeaters? The storm map is public. Their instability is not. For the first time, the room's attention left Dan entirely. Curtis edged toward the analog power cabinet near the wall. Ruth saw him and moved into the aisle, not touching him, simply placing herself between his hand and the breaker. Victor lifted both palms. Commander, this is becoming adversarial. We should suspend the test until Council can review access to your emergency data. Dan looked at the 5 green lights, then at the dark 6th unit beneath his hand. These machines were almost buried because the paperwork said they were dead, he said. Stopping now would only bury the question with them. Elena met his eyes, then turned to Marcus. Complete the test. Dan fitted the final filter, checked the solder joint, and began the 3-step calibration. Outside, thunder rolled across the depot hard enough to shake dust from the overhead beams. The digital status panel on the far wall flickered once. Then every northern sector indicator changed from amber to red. A warning tone sounded through the building. Black Ridge had lost 2 repeaters and the primary fiber link in the same breath. The room stared at the 6 radios, 5 glowing green, 1 waiting beneath Dan's steady hand. As the loudspeaker announced, North Sector units, Black Ridge has lost contact. The 6th radio came alive as the primary network died. Dan Mercer held the tuning control between 2 fingers, turned it the final fraction, and watched the last green indicator join the other 5 across the workbench. On the wall, the digital map of the northern sector remained red. On the table, 6 analog signal bars rose. Together. Black Ridge, this is Unit 12. Do you copy? Medical team at Cedar Creek requesting route clearance. School Transport 7. Blocked by fallen timber. 6 voices entered the room where 6 machines had once been labeled dead. No one laughed. Commander Elena Ward moved first. Transfer these units to the Black Ridge operations desk. Keep every camera recording. No one touches the analog breaker without my authorization. Marcus Reed lifted the first 2 radios while Ruth Alvarez carried the sealed evidence files. Dan took the remaining 4, their metal housings warm against his arms. Curtis Bell stood near the power cabinet with one hand half raised, as though he had been caught reaching for something he no longer had permission to control. Victor Hale's attorney began speaking about liability. Elena did not look at him. Lives first. Arguments later. The operations room beyond the depot wall had lost its polished digital comm. Monitors flashed red error codes. Phones rang without connecting. Rain struck the reinforced windows in hard silver lines, and emergency lights painted every face with alternating bands of white and crimson. Dan placed the radios in a row beneath the central screen. Their scratched casings looked almost small against the expensive equipment that had just gone silent. Channel assignments, Elena said. Marcus read them aloud. 1. Hill Medical. 2. North Fire. 3. River Search. For traffic control. 5. School Mutual Aid. 6. Maintenance. Dan adjusted each frequency, separating the carriers so the signals would not bleed into one another. He worked by ear as much as by meter, listening for the thin whistle that meant 2 channels were pressing too close. His hands were steady until the 5th speaker cracked and a child's voice came through the static. Black Ridge, can you hear us? Dan stopped breathing for 1 beat. The voice was older than the one stored in Leah's kitchen radio, but he knew it before the next word. Dad. Elena turned toward him. The room seemed to narrow around the speaker. Dan pressed the transmit key. Noah, this is Black Ridge. Are you with your driver? Yes. Stay in your seat. Do. Exactly what she says. We are. A tree fell across the road, and there's water behind us. The boy's voice trembled, but he was not alone, and he was not pretending to be brave beyond his years. Somewhere near him, the bus driver spoke into the microphone, explaining that the vehicle had stopped on high pavement but visibility was poor. Her handheld unit was losing power. Dan closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. Noah, look through the window without standing up. Tell me the route marker or any sign you can see. Pause followed. Rain hissed through the radio. There's a green mile sign, says 42, and a yellow sign with a black curve. Dan knew the road. He and Noah had passed that marker on fishing trips before Leah died. County Route 9, he said. North side of Miller's Bend. Elena pointed to the map. Traffic Unit 4. Confirm. Another radio answered immediately. Confirmed. Culvert flooding south of that position. Access only from the Ridge Road. Dan did not call Noah's name again. He assigned the traffic channel to guide the rescue trucks, the river team to monitor rising water, and the school channel to preserve the bus battery. He protected every child on that bus before allowing himself to be only one child's father. Behind him, Victor spoke in a low voice to Curtis. The legacy line needs to be isolated. Dan heard the words through the room. So did Elena. Why? She asked. Victor did not hesitate. To prevent unverified transmissions from contaminating official dispatch records. These transmissions are the official dispatch record now. Commander, an improvised network cannot be trusted during a regional emergency. The sixth radio clicked. A maintenance carrier opened without anyone touching it. At first, there was only breathing, fabric moving against a microphone, and the distant hum of the depot's electrical room. Then Victor's voice came through more clearly than before. Pull the legacy feed before Ward logs it. Curtis answered, the breaker is behind Ruth. The statement carried a digital timestamp. The station's automatic recorder marked the channel, source unit, and exact second. Elena looked toward the camera over the operations desk. This red light was on. Curtis's face emptied. That was a technical instruction, Victor said. I was preventing interference. Ruth removed a phone from the sealed property pouch and placed it beside the recorder display. Then this should be technical too. The county technician opened the recovered backup from Curtis's warehouse account. The message appeared on the large screen. He opened them. Move the bag before Ward checks inventory. Beneath it sat the time, sent minutes after Dan's private diagnostic test. The room absorbed the evidence in order. The duplicated invoices, the altered service form, the 2:13 a.m. access log, the 17 missing minutes of video, the audio saying the batch had to be dead, the 6 filters found in locker 14, and now a live instruction to cut the only working rescue link before Elena could preserve the record. Victor opened his mouth, but the school radio interrupted him. Black Ridge, we see emergency lights. Noah's voice was small beneath the storm. They found us. Dan's hand remained on the console. He let out a breath he had been holding since he first heard his son. Across the room, one dispatcher covered her mouth. Another lowered his head. The rescued bus was still several minutes from safety, but the route was open and the teams were connected. All 6 radios continued speaking. The sound was not dramatic. It was coordinates, battery levels, bridge conditions, medical updates, and ordinary people doing their jobs because someone had refused to throw away the means to hear them. Curtis moved toward the breaker again. Ruth stepped into his path. She did not touch him. She simply removed her access badge and placed it in Elena's hand. Suspend me if you have to, she said. But he is not shutting those radios off. Elena gave the badge to county security. Curtis Bell, your system access is suspended pending investigation. Step away from the cabinet. She then turned to Victor. Hale Emergency Systems is placed under emergency contract hold. All maintenance, billing, and access records are to be preserved. Any attempt to alter or delete them will be reported as interference with an active rescue operation. Victor's pen slipped from his fingers and struck the floor with a quiet plastic click. No one bent to retrieve it. His attorney stared at the timestamp on the recording. Curtis looked toward the camera, then away. The technicians who had whispered about Dan's faded shirt and low rank now stood without expression, their earlier certainty gone. In the silence between transmissions, the smallest sounds became clear. Rain ticking against glass, a printer feeding out preservation orders, the soft fan inside a battered radio, Dan's thumb moving once across the edge of his red-handled screwdriver. Elena faced him. "Mr. Mercer, the county will need your full technical statement." Dan looked at the 6 green lights, then at the map where the school bus had changed from red to yellow. "After they are home." There was no triumph in his voice. Only order. Only responsibility. Minutes later, the rescue team reported that every child had been transferred safely and the driver was accounted for. Noah came through one last time. "Dad, I'm here. I knew you would hear us." Dan lowered his eyes. "I heard everyone, buddy." The room went still again, not because Victor had been defeated, but because the difference between power and character had finally become impossible to miss. By dawn, the contract would be frozen, the evidence would be in county custody, and the 6 radios would no longer be called scrap. But when the county representative asked Dan what he wanted in return, no one yet knew whether he would ask for a title, compensation, an apology, or something large enough to keep another family from ever needing the same miracle.